The first time Elias saw her, she had a pistol pressed against a gambler's jaw, her amber hair catching the lamplight of the saloon like fire in motion. The crowd hushed, whiskey glasses frozen in midair, cards slipping from nervous fingers. The smell of spilled gin mixed with tobacco smoke and the iron tang of blood from someone's split lip. In that choking air, Elias felt something shift, as if the night had been waiting for this woman to ignite it. Her name was Mae Donovan, 30 years old, and she was the kind of woman who never asked for permission. Her laughter cut sharp as a blade, her boots clicked with defiance on warped wooden floors, and men learned fast not to mistake her wild beauty for weakness. She didn't belong in a saloon, or maybe she was the only one who truly did. Mae was flame, untamed, and every man who thought he could hold her usually wound up burned. Elias, a broad-shouldered Apache warrior with a scar like a lightning strike down his cheek, hadn't meant to linger in this town. His horse needed water, his supplies were running low, and he only planned to pass through before heading back into the desert. But fate had a strange way of binding two storms together that it began with a fight. Not his fight, not at first. Elias had been standing near the door, his eyes scanning the poker tables, when two drunken ranch hands started shoving each other. Words flew, fists followed, and before long, half the saloon erupted into chaos. Mae, caught in the swirl, didn't retreat. She climbed right into the storm, cursing like a soldier and throwing herself into the brawl as if she owned it. Elias saw a man grab her wrist, twisting it cruelly. Something in him snapped. With one fluid motion, Elias tore the man away, his fist cracking across the ranch hand's jaw like thunder. The man went down hard, but the saloon didn't stop raging. More fists, more shouting, chairs toppling, glasses shattering. Elias fought like the desert itself, merciless, silent, unstoppable. By the time the sheriff and his deputies stormed in, the place was wrecked, and Elias stood over three groaning men, his chest heaving like a wild animal's. Mae was beside him, hair tangled, knuckles bruised, a grin tugging at her lips. "Well now," she said breathlessly, cocking her head at him. "Didn't think I'd see the day an Apache fought at my side." The sheriff wasn't charmed. He wasn't blind either. Elias and Mae were hauled outside and chained to the same post like a pair of outlaws. The sheriff spat in the dirt, muttered about savages and wildcats, and left them there under the moonlight to stew. That was when Elias first felt the danger of her. Not from her pistol or her temper, but from the way she leaned against the wooden post with her wrists bound, smiling like she owned the stars. She smelled faintly of smoke and rosewater, her hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. She was nothing like the women Elias had known among his people, disciplined, graceful, tied to duty. Mae was reckless, bold, a creature who carved her own path with blood and laughter. "You've got a mean punch," she said after a long silence, her eyes glinting in the half-light. "But you don't strike me as the type who picks fights for whiskey money. So what's your story, Scarface?" He said nothing. Silence was safer. But Mae wasn't the kind of woman who let silence breathe. "Fine then," she went on, tilting her head so her gaze lingered on the scar that split his cheek. "If you're not talking, I'll just keep guessing. Outlaw? Deserter? Maybe you're running from some woman who broke your heart." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. He kept his eyes fixed on the desert horizon, its endless stretch glowing under the pale moon. But inside, a spark had caught. Mae Donovan wasn't afraid of him. That was unusual. Most people avoided his shadow. Others spat at his boots. She met his gaze straight on, as if daring him to blink first. Hours passed, the saloon's chaos fading into quiet night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the far-off howl of a coyote, the creak of chains as they shifted against the post. They didn't speak much more, but Elias felt the heat of her presence beside him, a living flame brushing against his skin. He told himself it was nothing. Just a night. Just a woman. But deep down in the scarred chambers of his heart, he already knew the truth. This woman would burn her way into his life, and there would be no turning back. The moon rode high above the town when the sheriff finally stomped away, leaving Elias and Mae shackled to the post like a pair of prize animals. The night was quiet except for the faint hiss of wind dragging grit down the empty street. Elias could feel the weight of the chain pulling at his wrists, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the woman standing only inches from him. Mae leaned against the wood as though this were all some grand joke. Her lips curled into a smile that belonged more to a predator than a damsel. "You know," she murmured, her voice low and husky, "I've been tied to worse company." "At least you don't stink of fear." Elias said nothing. Words had always been costly for him, and silence was his armor. Yet Mae seemed to take that as an invitation to fill the air with her own. She talked about the gambler she'd threatened earlier, how he'd cheated her out of $50. She spoke of the saloon's crooked owner, of the sheriff's weakness for bribes, of the men who thought they owned her. Her story spilled out like whiskey from a broken bottle, messy and fiery, yet laced with truth. Elias listened. He always listened. That was his gift, the skill that had kept him alive on battlefields and through long nights on the desert trails. Listening told him who a person really was beneath their words. Mae Donovan was dangerous, yes, but not in the way most folks thought. Her danger came from her hunger for freedom, from her refusal to bend. She lived like a river in flood season, crashing, roaring, impossible to dam. Hours crept by, the nights stretching long. The sheriff had promised to deal with them in the morning, which could mean a fine, jail, or worse. Elias shifted his weight, testing the chain, but it held fast. Mae caught the motion and laughed under her breath. "Don't bother," she said, her amber eyes glinting. "That lock's tighter than a preacher's jaw on Sunday. Unless you got some Apache magic up your sleeve, we're stuck." The word Apache carried weight. She didn't say it with scorn like others did, nor with fear. She said it like a fact, acknowledging the power in it. Still, Elias felt the old wound reopen years of being called savage, outlaw, enemy. His people pushed from their lands, hunted like animals. And here he was, chained outside a saloon in a white man's town. He clenched his jaw, staring out into the desert night. Mae tilted her head, studying him. "You've seen things," she said softly, her voice dropping its sharpness. "That scar, it's not just skin deep, is it?" For a moment, he met her eyes. In them, he saw no mockery, only curiosity, maybe even respect. The chain between them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. He wanted to tell her something, anything, but words caught in his throat like stones. Instead, he shifted again, this time more forcefully. The post creaked. Mae raised her brows. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually planning to break us out?" Elias braced his muscles, every sinew straining. The chain groaned, metal grinding against wood. The scar across his face pulled tight as his teeth clenched with the effort. Mae watched, a flicker of awe softening her grin. Finally, with a sharp crack, the old wooden post gave way, splinters flying. They stumbled free, wrists still bound together by the chain but no longer anchored to the saloon. Mae burst into laughter, rich, reckless, wild. "You really are full of surprises, aren't you, Scarface?" Elias didn't answer, only jerked his head toward the alley. They needed cover before the sheriff returned. The two of them ran through the shadowed streets, bound wrist to wrist, moving like mismatched partners in a dangerous dance. Mae's skirts tangled around her legs, but she kept up, her breath hot and fast. Elias led them into the darkness beyond the last lantern glow, where desert sand began swallowing the edge of town. They collapsed against a weathered wall, catching their breath. Mae's laughter finally faded, and in its place came something else, something quieter. She studied him with those burning eyes and whispered, "Maybe we're not stuck together by accident. Maybe it's fate." Elias turned his head, the desert wind lifting his long black hair. Fate was not a word he trusted. Fate had stolen too much from him already. And yet, staring at Mae Donovan, chained at his side, he felt the unsettling truth. Maybe she was right. The night had bound them together, and neither of them knew just how dangerous that bond would become. The desert night swallowed them whole. Elias and Mae stumbled through the shadows beyond the last lamplight of town, their wrists still chained together. Sand crunched under their boots, the air dry and sharp, filled with the faint howl of coyotes somewhere far off. Every step was a fight to keep pace. Elias with his long, steady stride, Mae with her skirts catching on sagebrush and rocks. "Slow down, Scarface," Mae hissed, tugging against the chain. "Not all of us got legs made for running through cactus." Elias didn't break stride. He was listening, the way he always did, to the silence behind them. Silence could mean safety, but it could also mean pursuit. And Elias knew the sheriff of Dry Creek wasn't the type to let two troublemakers slip away without a chase. After what felt like miles, Elias stopped in the lee of a boulder. The desert spread before them in waves of silver sand under the moon. He crouched low, pulling Mae with him. She huffed, brushing dust from her dress, but she stayed quiet for once. "We hide here?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Rest, then move." His voice was low, gravelly, like stones grinding in a stream. Mae tilted her head at him, eyes glinting with curiosity. "So the savage does speak," she teased softly. "Thought maybe you were mute, or just too proud to waste words on the likes of me." Elias ignored the jab. Pride wasn't the reason. Words were weighty, and he only spent them when they mattered. But Mae Donovan was the kind of woman who poked and prodded at silence like a child with a stick at a rattlesnake. Leaned back against the boulder, amber hair loose around her shoulders, and studied him openly. "You're not like the men I'm used to. Most of them can't shut up long enough to breathe. You," she tapped the chain with her fingertip, "you got storms inside you. I can feel it." Elias turned his head sharply, meeting her gaze. For a heartbeat, the night seemed to hold its breath. Mae didn't flinch under his stare. She only smiled, that wild, dangerous smile of hers. Suddenly, a shout cracked the silence. Then another. Voices carried on the windmen, riding hard. The sheriff's posse. Elias rose in one fluid motion, pulling Mae up with him. Her pistol was gone, confiscated by the sheriff, and Elias had only his fists and the desert. But he knew this land better than the men chasing them. He tugged Mae toward a dry creek bed, the chain clanking softly as they scrambled down into its shadows. They crouched low, pressed against the earth as hoofbeats thundered above. Mae's breathing came fast and ragged, her hand gripping his arm. The riders passed, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the night, dust clouding the stars. Elias waited until the sound faded before he dared move. Mae let out a shaky laugh. "Well, ain't this romantic?" she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "Chained together, hiding in the dirt, running from the law. If my mama could see me now." Elias almost smiled, but his instinct screamed that this was only the beginning. They walked on until dawn bled over the horizon, painting the desert gold. Exhaustion weighed on Mae, her steps faltering, but Elias steadied her with the chain between them. When they finally reached an abandoned shack near the foothills, they ducked inside, the roof sagging but walls still strong enough to shelter them. Mae collapsed onto a crate, dragging in deep breaths. She wiped sweat from her brow, then glanced at him with a grin. "You ever notice how trouble follows me like a dog? And now you're stuck with me, Scarface. Think you'll regret it?" Elias crouched near the doorway, watching the desert outside. Regret. The word twisted in his chest. He had known regret before losing his brothers in raids, losing his people's lands to greedy settlers. But this was different. Mae was fire and danger, yes, but she was also alive in a way that pulled at him, lit something long buried. He finally looked back at her, his dark eyes steady. No, the single word hung between them like a spark. Mae's grin faded, replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't have a quip ready. She just stared at him, lips parted, the chain binding them glinting in the dawnlight, and in that fragile silence, Elias knew, whatever road they were on now, it was no longer just about survival. Something far more dangerous was taking root. The shack smelled of dust, dried sage, and old wood. Its walls leaned with the weight of years, but to Elias it was shelter, a pause in the endless chase. He stood at the doorway, watching dawn creep across the desert, every muscle taut. Mae sat inside, stretching her legs across a broken crate, her amber hair tangled from the night's run, her dress clinging with sweat. Even exhausted, she carried that same untamed spark. "You always stand like that?" she asked, her voice hoarse but teasing. "Like you're carved from stone and waiting for lightning to strike?" Elias didn't answer. He was listening again. The desert spoke in whispers, the scrape of a lizard, the distant cry of a hawk. No hoofbeats, no voices. For now, they were safe. Mae sighed and leaned back. "You ever gonna tell me what you're running from? 'Cause I don't believe for a second you wandered into Dry Creek just to buy flour and whiskey." He turned his head slightly, the scar on his cheek catching the wheat morning light. "Not running," he said simply. Mae smirked. "Everybody's running from something. Some of us just make it look prettier." Her words lingered and silence stretched. Elias didn't share stories easily. His life had been carved by blood and loss, things too sacred to throw into casual talk. But he found himself watching Mae, the curve of her smile, the defiance in her eyes, and for the first time in years he wanted someone to know. "My people," he said at last, his voice low, rough as gravel. "Driven from land. Soldiers came. Burned homes. Took lives. I fight. For what is left." Mae's teasing faded. She sat up straighter, her eyes searching his. "So that scar?" Elias touched the jagged line on his cheek. "Battle. I lived. Others did not." For a moment, Mae said nothing. Then, surprisingly, she reached across the short distance, brushing her fingers lightly against the chain that bound them. "Guess we both got ghosts chasing us," she murmured. Elias tilted his head, studying her. "Yours?" Mae gave a short laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I got plenty. Let's just say, when you're a woman who don't know her place, the world makes sure to remind you. Men tried to own me. Sheriff tried to tame me. I fought back. And here I am, wild, reckless Mae Donovan, chained to a scarred Apache warrior in the middle of nowhere." Her voice cracked on the edges of her bravado, and Elias caught it. She wasn't just wild for the sake of it. She was wild because she had to be. Before he could respond, a sudden noise split the morning air, the sharp clatter of hoofbeats. Elias' instincts flared. He pulled Mae down behind the shack just as riders appeared on the ridge. Dust rose around them, sunlight glinting off rifles. The sheriff's posse had found their trail. Mae's breath hitched. "Damn it, we're boxed in." Elias's eyes scanned the land, the slope of the foothills, the curve of the desert. His mind worked like a hawk's flight, swift, precise. "Creek," he muttered, pointing toward a gully snaking away from the shack. They ran, chain rattling between them, sand kicking up behind their boots. Bullets cracked, spitting dirt at their feet. Mae cursed under her breath, her skirt snagging on brush, but Elias yanked her forward with relentless force. The creek bed offered cover, shallow but winding. They ducked low, hearts pounding, the sun blazing overhead. When the gunfire faded, they collapsed against the rocks, both gasping. Mae pressed her back to the stone, eyes wide with adrenaline. "Scarface," she panted, "you trying to get me killed, or are you always this much fun?" Despite the danger, Elias almost laughed, a sound deep in his chest that startled even him. Mae caught it, and her lips curved into a grin, softer this time. They sat there, the desert roaring quiet around them, bound wrist to wrist, two fugitives chased by law and ghosts alike. And in that silence, Mae whispered, "Maybe fate's not so cruel after all." Elias looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't believe in fate, but the heat between them, the chain linking their lives, the way her presence stirred something buried deep, whatever this was, it was no accident. The desert sun was merciless, beating down like a hammer as Elias and Mae pressed deeper into the gully. Hours of running, hiding, and doubling back left them coated in dust, their throats raw. Every step reminded them of the chain binding their wrists. It was both curse and lifeline forcing them together, keeping them from straying too far apart. By midday, the posse's shouts had faded, swallowed by distance. But Elias knew better than to relax. Lawmen were stubborn as buzzards. Once they had a scent, they'd circle back until the bones were bare. Inside the canyon, shadows offered a brief reprieve. Mae stumbled to her knees, panting. "Scarface, I swear. If the heat don't kill me, you dragging me through cactus sure will." Elias handed her his water flask. She hesitated only a second before drinking greedily, the water spilling over her lips and soaking the neckline of her torn dress. He watched her silently, every drop she drank costing him, but he offered it anyway. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and gave him a wry smile. "Didn't peg you for the generous type. Survival," Elias said simply. Mae tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe. Or maybe you got more heart under all that stone than you care to admit." Her words dug deeper than he expected. He turned away, scanning the canyon walls. But Mae wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her voice softer now, "most men I've met, they only take. They see a woman like me and figure I'm theirs to use, theirs to tame. You," she paused, and for once her grin faltered. "You don't look at me like that. You don't look at me like I'm a prize." Elias met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Not prize, fire," Mae blinked, taken aback. Then slowly, a smile spread across her lips, not sharp or mocking, but something gentler. "Fire, huh? That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever called me." The moment stretched between them, the chain glinting in the dusty light like a thread of fate. A hawk's cry shattered it. Elias stiffened. He knew that sound, it wasn't random. His people sometimes used hawks as warnings. His eyes swept the cliffs until he spotted movement, a rider's shadow cresting the ridge. Not the sheriff's men. Someone else. He pulled Mae into the shelter of an overhang just as three figures appeared above, silhouetted against the sky. These men weren't lawmen. Their hats were wider, their coats dust-stained, rifles slung across their backs. Outlaws. Mae swore under her breath. "Great. If it ain't the law, it's worse. I know those boys they ride with Hank Mercer. He's meaner than a rattler in a boot." The men scanned the canyon, their voices carrying faintly. Elias's muscles tightened. He knew Mae wasn't exaggerating. These weren't the type to drag fugitives back to town. These were the type to leave bodies in the sand. Mae glanced at him, her fiery hair falling across her face. "Got a plan, Scarface?" He studied the terrain, the rocks, the shadows, the narrow cut of the canyon. Escape wasn't possible. Fight or hide. With her chained to him, hiding was risky. Fighting was death. Yet his gaze hardened. He had survived worse. Mae must have read it in his eyes because she gave a short, breathless laugh. Well, if we're going down, at least I picked the right partner. The outlaws dismounted, moving into the canyon. Dust swirled around their boots, the clink of spurs echoing. Elias drew Mae deeper into the shadows, pressing her back against the rock. Their bodies were close, too close. Her breath fanned his neck, her heart racing like a trapped bird. "Scarface," she whispered, her tone different, now raw, vulnerable. "Why'd you save me back there?" "In the saloon." "You didn't have to." He looked at her, his scar catching the faint light. "Because—" He hesitated, words heavy on his tongue. "Because you fight." Mae's eyes widened, and for once she didn't laugh, didn't tease. She just stared at him like she was seeing something new. Then, slowly, she leaned closer, their foreheads nearly touching, the chain binding their wrists like a vow neither had made. Footsteps crunched closer. Voices grew louder. The danger was real, pressing in. Yet Elias felt another danger just as sharp, the pull between them. The fire he'd named, burning brighter with every breath they shared. The canyon echoed with the beat of hooves, a sound that curled down the stone walls like a warning. Mae pressed her back to the rock, her breathing shallow, her amber hair catching the faint silver of starlight. The chain between her and Elias rattled with each slight movement, a harsh reminder that their fates were still bound. Elias crouched at the edge of the canyon floor, his body a dark silhouette against the pale glow of the desert moon. Shirtless, his skin gleamed with sweat, his long black hair loose and wild in the night air. The turquoise and bone beads of his necklace clinked softly, the only sound he allowed himself to make. His eyes, dark, unblinking, were fixed on the riders above. "They'll find us," Mae whispered, her voice sharp with fear, though she tried to steady it. "Only if we let them," Elias replied in a low growl, each word heavy with quiet certainty. For hours they had evaded the posse, slipping between ravines and dry washes, using every fold of the land to their advantage. But now, hemmed in by towering cliffs, Mae wondered if their luck had finally run out. She pressed her palm against the rock wall as if searching for an opening that wasn't there. Elias reached over, steadying her hand with his own. His palm was warm, rough with calluses, and his touch made her freeze, not with fear, but with something she couldn't name. "Trust me," he said. Mae searched his face. The scar that cut across his cheek caught the moonlight, a brutal reminder of the violence he'd survived. Yet his eyes, intense but steady, held no malice for her. Against all reason, she nodded. The riders above shouted, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls. A rifle cracked and sparks flew where the bullet struck the rocks near Mae's shoulder. She gasped, stumbling forward, but Elias pulled her tight against his chest, shielding her. She felt the solid strength of him, the thrum of his heartbeat like a war drum against her ear. "Stay low," he ordered, his breath hot against her hair. Before Mae could protest, Elias tugged her forward, leading her along the canyon wall. They moved like shadows, the chain between them clinking softly, dangerously loud in the silence. At one point, Mae's dress snagged on a jagged stone, tearing further, but she didn't stop. She could feel Elias's urgency, his energy like fire pulling her along. At the far end of the canyon, a narrow cleft opened into darkness. Elias pushed Mae through first, then followed, pressing his back against the stone as they squeezed into the hidden space. It was barely wide enough for them to stand shoulder to shoulder. Mae's breath came in sharp bursts, and she realized her body trembled not just from fear, but from the closeness of him. The riders' voices grew louder, their lanterns spilling light across the canyon floor. Mae held her breath, the weight of silence pressing on her chest. She felt Elias's arm brush against hers, his muscles tense as a coiled spring. In that moment, she realized how little separated them, two fugitives, chained by circumstance, surviving by inches. One lantern swung dangerously close. its glow licking the mouth of their hiding place. Mae's heart pounded so loudly she was sure it would betray them. She instinctively reached for Elias's hand, clutching it tightly. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, steady grounding. Minutes dragged like hours. Finally, the riders cursed and moved on, their lanterns shrinking into the distance. When the last hoofbeat faded, Mae sagged against the stone, letting out a shaky laugh that was half relief, half disbelief. Elias turned his face toward her, close enough that she could see the sharp lines of his jaw in the dim light. His voice was quiet, almost softer than the night itself. "You were brave," Mae scoffed, though her voice trembled. "I was terrified." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Elias said, his dark eyes locked on hers. "It is moving despite it." Something in her chest tightened. For the first time, she saw not just the fierce warrior, but the man beneath the scars, the one carrying a burden she couldn't yet understand. And for reasons she didn't dare name, she wanted to understand it. The night stretched on, wrapping them in silence. Bound by the chain, bound by circumstance, they leaned against the canyon wall together, waiting for dawn. Mae didn't know what tomorrow would bring: capture, escape, or something stranger still. But as she sat there beside Elias, his presence steady and unyielding, she knew one truth with startling clarity: she was no longer running just for survival. She was running for him, too. The first light of dawn crept across the desert, turning the cliffs into slabs of fire and shadow. Mae sat on a boulder at the mouth of the canyon, her torn dress heavy with dust, her amber hair tangled from the night's ordeal. Her body ached, but it was the weight inside her chest that made her tremble most, the weight of what she now knew about herself. Elias stood a few feet away, his tall frame outlined by the rising sun. Muscular, scarred, shirtless, he seemed carved from the very stone around them. His long black hair whipped in the wind, and the turquoise and bone beads of his necklace glimmered like sparks of another world. He was silent, scanning the desert horizon for any sign of the riders. But Mae could tell his mind was elsewhere. "They'll keep hunting us," Mae said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice cracked. "They won't stop." Elias turned, his dark eyes catching hers. "Then we will not stop either." Mae shook her head, laughing bitterly. "You speak as if it's so simple. But you don't know what it's like for a woman like me. I've lived my whole life caged by men's choices. Saloon owners, drunk cowhands, men who thought they could buy me or break me. And now here I am, chained to another man." She rattled the iron link between them, her words sharp, but her eyes wet. Elias stepped closer, the dawn light catching the scar on his cheek. "Do you truly believe I see you as a cage?" His voice was low, steady, like the desert wind itself. Mae faltered. She wanted to say yes, to keep her anger sharp like a blade. But his gaze unraveled her defenses. "No," she admitted in a whisper. Elias crouched in front of her, his broad shoulders blocking the rising sun. For a moment, all Mae saw was him, the strength in his frame, the scars of battles past, but also the strange gentleness in his eyes. "You are not a possession," Elias said. "You are fire, wild, untamed. You have fought with me, endured hunger and bullets, and still you stand. You do not belong to any man, not even me." Mae's breath caught. She had never heard words like that from a man before. Then why? She asked, voice trembling. "Why stay with me when you could cut this chain, vanish into the desert, and never look back?" For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He reached into the small pouch that hung from his necklace, pulling out a carved piece of turquoise shaped like a bird with outstretched wings. He held it in his scarred hand, the stone glowing faintly in the dawn. "Because," Elias said, his voice thick, "I choose you." Mae's eyes widened. The desert seemed to still around them, every sound swallowed by the weight of his words. "You what?" she whispered. Elias lowered himself onto one knee in the dust, the turquoise bird resting in his palm. The powerful Apache warrior, the man who had faced rifles and chains without flinching, bowed his head before her. "I have no gold, no land. My people have lost much, and I walk between worlds. But what I have, I offer to you. My strength, my name, my life." He looked up at her, his dark eyes burning with certainty. "Mae Donovan, will you be my wife?" The words struck her like thunder. Mae's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs. Of all the dangers she had faced, guns, chains, the endless desert, nothing had shocked her as much as this. She stared at him, speechless, as the sun crested the horizon, bathing them in light. The man who had once been her captor in circumstance was now offering himself as her partner by choice. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She laughed, the sound broken but real. "You're mad," she whispered. "Completely mad." Elias's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Perhaps. But so are you for standing beside me when you could have run." Mae looked at him. The scars, the strength, the fire in his eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel owned or caged. She felt seen. She felt chosen. Her hand shook as she reached out, closing his fingers around the turquoise bird. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Elias, I'll marry you." The canyon filled with the cry of a hawk circling overhead, its wings slicing the dawn. And in that wild desert, bound by chains yet free in a way neither had ever known, an Apache warrior and a Saloon woman forged a promise that would change both their lives forever.